"Sir, you can't sit here," the waitress hissed, pointing at the single dad's worn work boots. She told him this restaurant was for people who contributed to society, not those who fixed its junk in a garage. He didn't argue with her, he just stood there, feeling the subtle, rhythmic vibration in the glass floor that every other elite patron ignored. She thought she was protecting the prestige of the establishment, but she was actually dismissing the only man who could save every life in the building. This story is about why you should never judge a person by the dirt on their hands or the grease under their fingernails. Before I show you the exact moment when the billionaire owner fell to his knees, begging the humble mechanic for help, we need to see how this disaster truly began. By the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. Remind yourself that a man's worth isn't found in his wallet, but in the skills he hides behind a humble smile. This isn't a story about a rude waitress. It's about a guardian hiding in the shadows of a world that has forgotten how to look beneath the surface. The glass elevator of the zenith roared silently upward, a transparent capsule ascending 90 floors into the darkening sky. Elias Thorne held the hand of his 7-year-old son, Leo, feeling the boy's small excited tremors radiating through his palm. Leo was wearing his special occasion suit, a charcoal garment that was a bit too wide in the shoulders, paired with a bright red clip-on tie that he'd insisted on wearing since breakfast. Elias, however, was still in his work clothes, a rugged, oil-stained canvas jacket over a clean but faded flannel shirt. He had spent the last 14 hours under the chassis of a heavy freight truck, and though he'd scrubbed his hands twice with pumice soap, the stubborn dark crescents under his fingernails remained as a permanent testament to his labor. He looked out at the city of Athelgard shrinking beneath them, his mind momentarily drifting to the structural blueprints he used to study in the military. He'd been a lead combat engineer, a man who understood how the world stayed upright. But now he was just a man trying to give his son a birthday to remember. When the doors whispered open on the 90th floor, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The air was thin, expensive, and heavy with the scent of white lilies and high-end perfume. It was a world of polished marble and quiet ego. Sasha stood behind a podium of dark, gleaming mahogany that likely cost more than Elias's truck. She was the gatekeeper of this glass cathedral, and her eyes were already narrowed in sharp judgment before the father and son could even step onto the marble foyer. She didn't see a father fulfilling a deep promise, she saw a blemish on the restaurant's aesthetic perfection, a smudge of grease on a silk canvas. Her gaze raked over his heavy leather boots, scuffed and worn from years on concrete floors, and her expression curdled as if he were a physical threat to the room's atmosphere. "I have a reservation," he said, his voice low and steady, cutting through her silent appraisal. He didn't flinch under her gaze. He had stood before generals and faced down structural collapses in active war zones. A waitress with a superiority complex wasn't going to rattle his composure. But as he spoke, his feet registered something that no one else in the room seemed to notice. A low-frequency hum was traveling through the floor, a harmonic dissonance that suggested the building's wind compensation dampers were oscillating slightly out of sync. He looked past her, noticing a microscopic hairline fracture spiderwebbing across the base of a decorative support pillar near the entrance. It was a sign of stress, a warning written in stone that only an expert eye could translate. "I'm sure there's been a mistake, sir," Sasha replied, her voice a sharp, clinical chill that bypassed him and struck directly at Leo's beaming face. The boy's smile faltered, his hand tightening in his father's grip as he looked up at the woman. "This establishment has a very strict standard of presentation. Perhaps there's a diner on the ground floor or a local pub that would be more comfortable for someone of your particular background. We wouldn't want to cause a scene." The dismissal was systemic, a rejection of the grit and sweat that kept the city running. Elias felt the familiar surge of protective instinct, but he kept it simmered down to a low glow. He wasn't here for himself. He was here because he had promised his late wife Sarah that Leo would always feel like the world was his to explore, no matter how much they struggled. The zenith was Leo's dream, a place where he could touch the sky and see the clouds at dinner, and Elias was willing to endure any amount of elitist scorn to make that dream a reality for one night. He looked at Sasha, his eyes hardening with a quiet, unshakable power that made her momentarily stumble over her next words. He wasn't leaving. He knew this building better than she did, and he knew his son deserved that seat. The tension in the foyer began to thicken, matching the growing, rhythmic pulsing in the glass floor beneath their feet. Sasha's face contorted, her carefully applied crimson lipstick sharpening into a thin, jagged line of pure indignation. She didn't just look at the man, she looked through him, as if he were a ghost haunting a gala he hadn't been invited to. "I don't care if you have a reservation for the Queen of England herself," she snapped, her voice rising just enough to draw the attention of a nearby table of executives in tailored navy suits. "This is a 5-star establishment, not a community center. Look at you. You're covered in grease, you smell like a diesel engine, and those boots are probably tracking God knows what onto our hand-woven rugs. Sir, I'm being as polite as I can be, you simply cannot sit here." The executives at the corner table didn't look away. Instead, they leaned in, their faces glowing with a cruel, entertained light. One woman, draped in a silk pashmina that cost more than the mechanic's monthly rent, let out a soft, melodic laugh that carried across the foyer like the tinkling of ice in a crystal glass. "It's adorable that they think a reservation is all it takes," she whispered to her companion, loud enough for Elias to hear. "I suppose next we'll have the janitor demanding a seat at the chef's table." The man beside her smirked, adjusting his gold cufflinks with a flourish of practiced arrogance. The atmosphere in the room was rapidly becoming toxic, a thick soup of elitism that sought to drown the two intruders in shame. Elias felt the heat rising in his neck, a slow burning fuse that he fought to keep under control. He could handle the insults directed at him, he'd heard worse from drill sergeants and angry foremen, but he felt the way his son's small hand had gone limp in his own. Leo was looking down at his scuffed shoes, the excitement that had carried him up 90 floors evaporating into a quiet, crushing realization that he didn't belong. It was the very thing his father had promised would never happen. Subscribe with the bell on because you won't want to miss the moment the tables finally turn on those who think they're untouchable. "My money is just as green as theirs," he said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate against the very glass walls of the restaurant. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. There was a weight to his words that came from a lifetime of doing the heavy lifting while men like those at the table watched from the sidelines. "And my son has been looking forward to this dinner for 6 months. We aren't here to cause trouble. We're here to eat. Now, if you'll just check your book for the name Thorn, we can end this little performance and get to our table." Sasha let out a sharp, theatrical sigh, her hand flying to the pearls at her throat as if she were facing a physical assault. "The performance is yours, sir." "And it's over. If you don't leave this instant, I will be forced to call security to have you escorted out in front of everyone. Think about your son. Do you really want him to see you being dragged out of a building because you couldn't accept that you don't fit in?" She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a venomous hiss. "People like you are the reason we have back entrances. Use one." He stood his ground, but his mind was no longer entirely on the argument. As the waitress spoke, he shifted his weight slightly, his boots pressing firmly into the marble. He wasn't just standing, he was measuring. He counted the number of patrons in the room, roughly 85, and then glanced at the massive, ornate ice sculpture of a soaring eagle dripping slowly onto a pedestal in the center of the room. He mentally calculated the dead load of the furniture, the live load of the crowd, and the structural capacity of the cantilevered floor plates he'd studied during the building's construction phase years ago. The harmonic vibration he'd felt earlier wasn't going away, it was intensifying. A rhythmic shudder that indicated the building's mass damper system was struggling to compensate for the high-altitude wind gusts buffeting the spire. He looked at the hairline fracture on the pillar again. It had grown by a fraction of a millimeter in the last 3 minutes. The elite diners around him were too busy laughing and sipping their vintage wines to notice that the very ground beneath their feet was beginning to groan under a stress it wasn't designed to handle in this specific weather window. To them, the world was a solid, unchanging stage built for their pleasure. To him, it was a complex machine that was starting to scream in a language only he could hear. "You're making a mistake," he said, his eyes locking onto hers with a sudden, chilling intensity that made her step back. "But it's not the one you think it is. You're worried about the rugs and the dress code, while the house is telling you it's tired of holding you up." He looked past her at the owner's closed office door at the far end of the hall, sensing that the person behind it was the only one who might listen before the subtle vibrations turned into something far more violent. The waitress, however, saw only defiance. She reached under her podium, her finger hovering over the security alert button, her face a mask of triumphant spite. Sasha's finger hovered over the silent alarm button, her eyes gleaming with the predatory satisfaction of someone about to erase a visible inconvenience. "Last chance, sir," she said, her voice dripping with a faux sweetness that felt like acid. "Walk out on your own, or be carried out like the trash you're currently tracking onto my floor. You don't belong here, and quite frankly, you're ruining the experience for everyone who actually earned their seat." She looked at the nearby table of executives, seeking their silent approval, which they gave with smirks and dismissive waves of their hands. The world seemed to shrink around the father and son, a high-altitude cage of judgment where their value was being measured solely by the scuffs on their leather shoes and the callous texture of their skin. The boy looked up, his small face flushed with a mix of confusion and burgeoning anger. He didn't understand why these people were being so mean to the man he worshipped, the man who could make any broken toy work again, and who read him stories every night until the shadows disappeared. "You're wrong." The child suddenly shouted, his voice cracking but clear enough to stop the laughter at the nearby table. "My dad isn't trash. He used to fix everything. He built the big bridges for the general when the bad guys blew them up. He saved a whole army once by stopping a wall from falling down, and the general gave him a special coin for it. Tell them, Dad. Tell them about the bridge at the river." The boy's hand gripped his father's flannel sleeve, his knuckles white, desperate for the man to defend himself with the truth of his past. He felt a sharp, familiar pang in his chest. He hadn't talked about those days in years, not since the heavy smell of diesel smoke and the sound of buckling steel had started to haunt his dreams. The quiet life of a local mechanic in a small garage was his sanctuary, a way to bury the ghost of the man he'd been, a lead combat engineer in the 101st Battalion. He had lived a life where the difference between a millimeter of steel and a second of time meant the life or death of hundreds of men. But looking at his son's desperate, pleading eyes, the memories flooded back with the force of a tidal wave. He remembered the heat of the desert, the way the air tasted of copper and dust, and the crushing responsibility of holding up the weight of an entire retreating division. In his mind, he was back in the Helmand province, standing on a crumbling riverbank while mortars rained down nearby. He remembered the frantic look in the eyes of a young captain named Julian, whose unit was trapped on the wrong side of a failing crossing. He had been the one to wade into the waist-deep, freezing water, his hands slick with hydraulic fluid and mud, as he manually jammed a structural wedge into a failing support strut. He had felt the bridge groaning against his shoulders, a literal titan trying to collapse, and he had held it. He had stayed there, a human pillar, until the last truck cleared the span. When he had finally climbed out, the captain had hugged him, weeping, and promised he would never forget the man who had stood where the earth gave way. But that was a different life. One he'd traded for the peace of anonymity. He looked at the waitress now, seeing the shallow vanity that blinded her to anything but surface-level wealth. She saw a mechanic, but he still saw the world in terms of load-bearing capacities and stress vectors. He didn't need a coin or a title to know his worth, but he hated that his son was learning that the world could be this cruel. The contrast between the grit of the war zone and the sterile, artificial luxury of this restaurant was jarring. Here, the only thing being tested was someone's patience with a dress code, while out there he had tested the very limits of human endurance and engineering. He took a deep breath, the scent of the lilies in the foyer suddenly feeling cloying and dishonest. "That's enough, Leo," he said softly, his voice a calm anchor in the rising storm of the room. He didn't need to brag about the medals in his drawer at home. He didn't need to prove his history to a woman who couldn't see past a stained jacket. But as he spoke, his boots registered a sharp, sudden change in the floor's vibration. The harmonic dissonance he'd felt earlier had shifted from a hum to a stutter. It was a rhythmic, uneven pulsing that suggested a primary structural damper had just seized. He looked at the ceiling, his eyes tracing the line where the glass panels met the steel frame, and he saw it, a tiny, almost invisible shiver in the grand chandelier. The waitress didn't notice. The executives didn't notice. They were too busy relishing the spectacle of a low-class man being put in his place. To them, the building was an invincible fortress of glass and steel, as solid as their bank accounts. But he knew better. He knew that even the grandest structures were fragile things, held together by the very laws of physics that they were currently ignoring. He felt the weight of the 90 floors beneath them, a massive, leaning tower that was beginning to struggle against the high-altitude wind shear. The air in the foyer seemed to grow heavy with an unspoken threat, a silent warning that the environment was no longer stable. "You really should check that pillar," he said, his voice devoid of anger, replaced by a cold, professional clinicality that made Sasha pause with her fingers still on the button. He pointed at the hairline fracture he'd noticed earlier. It wasn't just a crack anymore. It was a wound. A tiny flake of marble drifted to the floor, landing silently on the pristine rug she was so worried about. The wind is hitting the north face at 60 knots, and your primary compensator just locked up. If you don't call maintenance in the next 60 seconds, the glass in this foyer is going to start popping like champagne corks, and it won't be for a celebration. He wasn't guessing. He was calculating. And for the first time, a flicker of genuine uncertainty crossed the waitress's face as she looked at the pillar. Sasha's uncertainty lasted only a heartbeat before it was swallowed by a wave of defensive arrogance. She let out a sharp, mocking laugh that sounded like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "Now, you're a structural engineer too?" She jeered, finally pressing the security alert button with a triumphant flourish. "First, you're a war hero, according to your son, and now you're predicting the end of the world because of a little wind. It's pathetic, really. You'll say anything to stay in a room where you clearly don't belong." She turned her back on him, addressing the room at large. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this man's delusions. Security is on their way to remove this expert from the premises." The executives laughed again, one of them raising his glass in a mock toast to the mechanic. "I'll be sure to tell the architect you disapproved of his work." he called out, his voice dripping with condescension. But the joke died in the air as a low, ominous groan echoed through the dining room. It wasn't the sound of wind, and it wasn't the sound of the elevator, it was the sound of metal screaming under impossible tension. It was a deep, guttural bass note that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of everyone's bones. The massive chandelier overhead suddenly swayed, its crystal droplets chiming together with a frantic, metallic clatter that replaced the elegant background music with a sound of pure panic. He didn't move toward the exit. Instead, he moved toward the center of the foyer, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. He saw the shift before anyone else did. The glass panels, designed to flex slightly with the building's movement, were suddenly rigid. The primary stabilizer system had failed completely, and the 90-story spire was no longer swaying to dissipate the energy of the wind, it was absorbing it. He felt the floor beneath his boots tilt, not by much, perhaps only a fraction of a degree, but it was enough to cause a dozen wine glasses on the nearby tables to slide simultaneously toward the south wall. The graceful ice sculpture of the eagle shuddered and slid 6 inches across its pedestal, leaving a wet, jagged streak on the dark wood. "Everyone, stay away from the windows," he barked, his voice no longer that of a humble mechanic, but the sharp, undeniable command of an officer on a battlefield. The sheer volume and authority of his tone stopped the rising murmurs of the crowd. He wasn't asking, he was directing. He saw the panic beginning to bloom in the eyes of the patrons, the realization that their wealth and status provided no shield against the laws of gravity and structural failure. Sasha froze, her hand still clutching the podium, her face turning a sickly shade of gray as she watched the marble pillar she had been guarding suddenly sprout 3 more fractures, each one wider than the last. The lights flickered once, twice, and then plunged the entire 90-floor restaurant into a terrifying dim emergency glow. Red lights bathed the luxury space in the color of a warning. The automated voice of the building's safety system began to drone a calm, pre-recorded message about minor technical irregularities, but the sound of the building's frame twisting contradicted every word. The wind outside roared against the glass like a physical beast trying to claw its way inside. He knew exactly what was happening. The secondary hydraulic bypass hadn't kicked in because the sensors were likely calibrated for a standard load, not the overcapacity crowd Julian had packed into the room for the holiday weekend. He looked at Leo, who was standing perfectly still, watching his father with wide, trusting eyes. "Leo, stay right here. Do not move from this rug, do you understand?" The boy nodded solemnly, sensing the shift in his father's energy. He was no longer the man who fixed cars, he was the man who held the world together. He turned back to the room, seeing the head of security and 2 guards bursting through the service doors. They looked confused, their hands on their belts, expecting to find a rowdy drunk, not a darkened room full of terrified socialites, and a building that was literally moaning in pain. "Forget about me," he shouted at the guards as they moved toward him. "The stabilizer assembly in the northeast quadrant has seized. If you don't get the manual override keys from the manager's office right now, this floor is going to shear off its mounting points. Look at the floor-to-ceiling seams." He pointed to the corner of the room where the glass met the structural steel. A gap had appeared, wide enough to slide a hand through, revealing the terrifying black void of the night sky 90 stories up. The guards stopped in their tracks, their bravado evaporating as they looked at the widening maw of the building's failure. Sasha was trembling now, her elitist mask shattered. She looked at the man she had just insulted, seeing him standing tall in the red emergency light, his oil-stained clothes making him look like a dark specter of truth in a room of lies. She tried to speak, to assert her authority one last time, but the building gave another violent lurch, throwing her to her knees. A loud, sharp crack echoed through the foyer. the sound of the main support pillar finally giving way. Dust and plaster rained down on her expensive rugs, and for the first time in her life, she realized that the man she had called trash was the only thing standing between her and a 90-story fall. Sasha remained on her knees, her fingers digging into the thick pile of the white rug as another glass shattered nearby, the red vintage spreading like a dark, expanding wound across the pristine fabric. The building gave another sickening lurch, a slow, grinding tilt that made the massive floor-to-ceiling windows groan in their steel tracks. The security team, caught between their orders to remove the mechanic and the primal fear of the building's impending collapse, hesitated. Just as the lead guard reached out to grab the man's shoulder, a heavy, soundproofed door at the far end of the restaurant slammed open. Julian Vane, the billionaire owner of the Zenith, erupted from his executive suite, his face the color of ash and his tailored silk shirt damp with sweat. He wasn't looking at the guests or his staff. His eyes were glued to a high-end tablet that was screaming with flashing red icons and emergency telemetry data. The primary dampening fluid has lost pressure. Julian shouted, his voice cracking with a high-pitched desperation that silenced the whimpering patrons. The automated bypass is looped in a logic error. Does anyone in this building know how to access the manual override for the secondary hydraulic bank? He looked around the room, his gaze frantic, landing on his security team, who simply stared back with blank, uncomprehending expressions. They were trained to handle unruly guests, not structural engineering nightmares 90 floors above the pavement. The elite diners, the men who controlled hedge funds, and the women who ran international charities all sat frozen in their designer chairs, their power rendered utterly useless by a simple mechanical failure they didn't even understand. The owner's eyes swept across the foyer, eventually landing on the man in the stained canvas jacket. He stopped mid-stride, his breath hitching in his throat as he stared at the mechanic's face. The tablet nearly slipped from his trembling fingers. For a long, agonizing second, the sound of the wind and the groaning steel seemed to fade into the background. Julian didn't see a low-class intruder or a smudge on his restaurant's reputation. He saw a ghost from a decade ago, a man who had stood amidst the smoke and blood of a collapsing bridge in the Helmand province. He saw the face of the elite combat engineer who had once held 1,000 lives in his calloused hands while the world turned to rubble around them. By the way, if you haven't yet, smash that subscribe button and hit the bell to see how this hidden hero puts the elite back in their place. This story is just getting started. Thorn? Julian whispered, his voice barely audible over the howling wind outside. He took a staggering step forward, ignoring Sasha as she tried to crawl toward him for protection. Captain Thorn? Is that really you? He looked at the grease on the man's hands and the worn leather of his boots, his mind struggling to reconcile the legendary structural specialist he'd served with in the military with the humble mechanic standing before him. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He had spent the last hour worrying about his VIP list, while the only man on the planet capable of saving his skyscraper was being insulted and threatened with arrest in his own lobby. The mechanic didn't smile, and he didn't offer a polite greeting. He simply looked at the owner with a gaze that was as cold and structural as the steel beams surrounding them. Your secondary bank isn't responding because your sensors are reading an unbalanced load, Julian. The ice sculpture and the extra tables in the north quadrant have shifted the center of gravity past the safety threshold. The building thinks it's already falling, so it's locked the manual valves to prevent a further tilt. It's a fail-safe that's actually going to kill everyone in this room. He spoke with a terrifyingly calm precision, his mind already 3 steps ahead of the crisis. He knew exactly which valve had seized, and why the automated system was trapped in a digital hall of mirrors. Julian fell to his knees, not from a lurch of the building, but from the sheer weight of his own sudden, desperate hope. He reached out, his expensive cufflinks catching the red emergency light, and practically begged. "Please, I've tried everything from the console. The engineers are 20 minutes away by chopper, but we don't have 20 minutes. The shear pins on the north side are already at 98% capacity. I'll give you anything. The restaurant, the building, whatever you want. Just tell me you can stop this." He looked at the man he had once seen perform miracles with nothing but a wrench and a stubborn refusal to let a structure fail, praying that the years of civilian life hadn't dulled that razor-sharp edge. The mechanic looked over at his son, who was still standing on the small rug, his red tie straight and his eyes full of a quiet, unshakable pride. The boy wasn't afraid because his father was there, and in the boy's world, that was enough. He looked back at Julian, then at Sasha, who was staring up at him in horrified silence, her mouth agape as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. The power dynamic in the room hadn't just shifted, it had been completely inverted. The billionaire was on the floor, and the man with the dirty fingernails was the only person with the keys to their survival. He didn't care about the money or the building, but he cared about the promise he'd made to the boy standing behind him. "I don't want your money, Julian," he said, his voice cutting through the panic like a diamond through glass. "And I don't want your restaurant, but you're going to tell your staff to apologize to my son. And then, you're going to get out of my way and let me work. We're going to need a heavy-duty cable from the elevator hoist and every person in this room who still has the strength to stand." He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and began walking toward the maintenance hatch hidden behind the bar, his movements fluid and purposeful. The man who fixed junk was gone, the captain was back, and he was about to show them exactly what true leadership looked like when the lights went out. Julian's voice didn't just tremble, it shattered. He looked around the room at the pale, frozen faces of the city's elite, his hands sweeping out to indicate the man he had been ready to toss into the night. "Do you have any idea who this is?" Julian shouted, his words punctuated by another ominous groan from the building's steel skeleton. "This isn't just a mechanic. This is Captain Elias Thorne. He was the lead structural specialist for the 101st Engineering Battalion. They called him the Lion of the Helmand because he built bridges where the earth refused to hold. He saved my entire company from a gorge collapse 10 years ago, and I haven't seen a man with his level of technical genius since." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the whistling wind. The executives at the corner table, the ones who had laughed about janitors in Greece, suddenly looked like children caught in a lie. The woman with the silk pashmina lowered her head, her face turning a deep, shameful red. They had spent the last 20 minutes mocking a man whose military record was a legend they weren't even fit to read. The shift in the room was physical. The air felt different, charged with a sudden desperate reverence for the man in the work jacket. He wasn't the intruder anymore. He was the only authority that mattered in a world that was literally falling apart. Sasha looked as if she'd been struck. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes darting between her billionaire boss and the trash she'd tried to kick out. Her entire identity was built on the ability to sniff out status, yet she had missed the most powerful man in the room, because his power didn't come from a tailor. "Julian, I didn't know," she stammered, her voice thin and reedy. He didn't have a jacket. He looked like a common laborer. She tried to stand, her expensive heels clicking weakly on the marble, but Julian's glare pinned her back to the floor. "He is the reason you have a building to work in, Sasha," Julian hissed, his desperation turning into a cold, focused anger. "And right now, he's the only reason you might live to see tomorrow morning. You've spent the night treating him like dirt, and you've done it in front of his son." Julian turned back to Elias, his eyes pleading. Elias, I'm so sorry. I've let this place become something I'm not proud of. Please, tell me what to do. I'll follow any order you give. Just save them. Save the boy." Elias didn't look at Julian's outstretched hand. He was staring at the ceiling, his mind visualizing the tension maps of the 89th and 90th floors. He didn't have time for Julian's guilt or Sasha's excuses. The building gave another violent shudder, and a long, jagged crack appeared in the decorative plaster above the bar, raining white dust down into the expensive whiskey bottles. "Julian, shut up and listen to me," he said, his voice dropping into a rhythmic military cadence. "We don't have time for a debrief. The shear pins on the primary northeast joist are screaming. I can hear the metal fatigue from here." He turned his gaze toward Sasha, who flinched as if expecting a blow. But Elias wasn't interested in revenge. He was interested in results. "You," he said, pointing a grease-stained finger at the head waitress. "Go to my son. You're going to apologize to him. You're going to tell him that his father is the best engineer you've ever met. And then, you're going to sit him down at the safest table in the center of the room and make sure he has the best birthday dessert this kitchen has ever produced. If a single hair on his head is ruffled because you were too busy being a snob to watch the structural warnings, you'll answer to me. Do you understand?" Sasha nodded frantically, her tears finally breaking through her makeup. She scrambled toward Leo, who was watching the scene with a quiet, solemn dignity that far surpassed anyone else in the room. The boy didn't look surprised. He looked like he'd been waiting for the rest of the world to finally catch up to what he already knew. As Sasha began her whispered, sobbing apology to the child, Elias turned his back on the dining room, focusing entirely on the crisis at hand. The lion was fully awake now, and the adrenaline of the battlefield was coursing through his veins, sharpening his senses until he could practically feel the stress in the steel through the soles of his boots. "Julian, I need your belt." "Now," Elias commanded, reaching out his hand. The billionaire didn't hesitate. He stripped the $1,000 alligator leather from his waist and handed it over. Elias took it, testing the tensile strength with a sharp tug. "I also need a high-pressure CO2 canister from the bar and a set of heavy-duty pliers from the security station. We're going into the crawl space under the kitchen. If the hydraulic bypass is looped, we're going to have to manually vent the pressure and lock the secondary pins by hand." He looked at the owner, his eyes hard and unyielding. "It's going to be hot, it's going to be dangerous, and the floor might shift while we're under it. Are you coming, or are you just a suit?" Julian wiped the sweat from his brow, his jaw setting in a way that suggested he remembered a bit of his own training. "I'm coming, Captain," he said, his voice regaining some of its lost steel. He followed Elias toward the service hatch, leaving the terrified socialites to watch as the mechanic and the billionaire vanished into the guts of the building. The sound of the wind roared louder than ever, but for the first time since the lights went out, there was a sense of direction in the chaos. The man who fixed junk was about to perform his greatest repair yet. The service hatch was a gateway to a different world. As they descended the narrow, vertical ladder, the smell of lavender and expensive steak was replaced by the acrid metallic tang of hot oil and the stifling heat of a machine under extreme duress. Here, in the interstitial space between the 90th floor and the ceiling of the 89th, there was no marble, no art, and no pretense. There was only the raw, thrumming heart of the skyscraper, a forest of hydraulic lines, massive steel girders, and humming electrical conduits. Julian, a man accustomed to corner offices and soft leather chairs, struggled to keep his footing on the vibrating metal catwalk. The red emergency lights cast long, distorted shadows against the ribs of the building, making it look as though they were walking inside the ribcage of a dying giant. "Watch the steam line to your left," Elias warned, his voice projecting through the roar of the ventilation fans. He moved with a grace that Julian hadn't seen in a decade, his body instinctively adjusting to the pitch and roll of the building. To Julian, the building was a static asset. To Elias, it was a dynamic system currently losing its fight against the elements. Above them, the muffled sound of the dining room's panic was a distant, ghost-like murmur, but the mechanical sounds here were deafening. A high-pitched whistle, like a tea kettle left on a burner too long, told Elias that a high-pressure seal was on the verge of catastrophic failure. Julian fumbled with his tablet, his thumbs sliding over the glass screen. The system, it's totally unresponsive, Elias. I've tried the hard reset twice, but the sensors in the north quadrant are giving me a null value. If I can't get the data, I can't tell the dampers how much to compensate. He looked at the device as if it had betrayed him, his face illuminated by the cold, digital blue light. It was a perfect symbol of his failure. All the money in the world had bought the most advanced software. But the hardware was physically breaking, and the software didn't know how to handle the reality of bent steel and leaking fluid. The sensors are dead because the shear forces have already severed the fiber optic lines in the northeast corner, Elias replied, not even looking back as he navigated a cluster of pipes. Your fancy screen is looking for a world that doesn't exist anymore. Stop looking at the tablet and start looking at the structure. See that support plate? He pointed to a massive steel slab where the main cantilever beam met the vertical spire. The paint was flaking off in large, jagged curls, a phenomenon known as crazing that indicated the metal was being pushed past its elastic limit. That plate is holding up every person in that restaurant. If it snaps, the entire north floor will drop 6 inches instantly. The jolt will pop the glass like bubbles. We aren't here to reboot a computer, Julian. We're here to stop a landslide. Back in the dining room, the atmosphere was a surreal mix of terror and bizarre obedience. Following Elias's command, Sasha had seated Leo at the large circular table in the very center of the room, the point of maximum structural stability. She was hovering over him, her hands trembling as she served a towering chocolate souffle that the chef had prepared in a frantic, confused rush. The other patrons watched the boy as if he were a religious icon, their own safety seemingly tied to his comfort. Sasha, who had moments ago looked at the boy with disgust, was now tucking a linen napkin into his collar with the devotion of a penitent. She kept looking at the service hatch, her eyes wide, waiting for the man she had called trash to emerge and tell her she was allowed to live. In the crawl space, the lurches were getting more frequent. A sudden, violent jolt threw Julian against a support beam, his tablet finally flying from his hands and shattering on the metal, grating below. "It's over," Julian groaned, clutching his bruised shoulder. "The building is going. I can feel it. We have to get out of here, Elias. We have to try the elevators before the rails twist." The billionaire's composure was finally gone, replaced by a raw, naked terror. He looked at the dark, narrow tunnels and saw only a tomb. Elias turned, his face illuminated by a sudden spark from a failing electrical junction. He looked at Julian with a terrifyingly calm clarity. "Nobody is leaving, and nothing is over until I say it is. We aren't leaving those people up there, and I'm sure as hell not leaving my son. Now, get that CO2 canister and follow me to the secondary hydraulic bank. We have to freeze the seized valve to shrink the metal, then manual force the bypass with your belt. It's the only way to equalize the pressure." He didn't wait for Julian to agree. He reached out and grabbed the billionaire by the front of his expensive shirt, hauling him to his feet with a strength that left no room for argument. "You're not an owner right now, Julian. You're a laborer. Act like it." They reached the primary hydraulic housing, a massive cylinder that was vibrating so violently it was a blur. The smell of burning fluid was thick enough to taste. Elias knelt before the machine, his hands moving with the practiced precision of a surgeon. He could hear the building's internal clock ticking down, the rhythm of the wind gusts matching the pulse of the failing hydraulics. He had saved Julian once on a bridge made of wood and mud. Today, he would do it on a bridge of glass and light. The mechanic's boots were planted firm on the metal floor, his focus absolute as he began the desperate work of salvaging the sky. Elias grabbed the CO2 canister from Julian's trembling hands. The pressure gauge on the side of the housing was pinned deep into the red zone, the needle vibrating so fast it looked like a blur. "Stay back," he warned, his voice a low, gravelly command. He aimed the nozzle at the seized bypass valve, a massive iron wheel that was currently glowing with a dull, dangerous heat. As he pulled the trigger, a cloud of freezing white vapor erupted, hissing like a nest of disturbed vipers. The temperature in the small crawlspace plummeted, and for a moment, the acrid smell of burning oil was replaced by the clean, biting scent of dry ice. "The metal is going to contract," Elias explained, his eyes never leaving the frost forming on the valve. "When it does, there's going to be a loud crack. Don't jump, and don't let go of that support rail. If the pressure vents too fast, this whole room is going to turn into a steam cooker." He didn't sound worried, he sounded like a man reading a familiar blueprint. Julian watched him, his own hands slick with sweat and grime, feeling a sudden, sharp realization. He had always thought his wealth made him a master of his domain, but here in the guts of his own building, he was a tourist. The man he'd nearly let his staff throw out was the only person who actually understood the language the skyscraper was screaming. By the way, if you're rooting for the underdog to show the elite what real skill looks like, subscribe with the bell on so you never miss a moment of this high-stakes vindication. We're about to see just how much one man's training is worth when the world starts to tilt. The building gave another massive, gut-wrenching heave. Above them, they heard the sound of a heavy table sliding across the marble floor, followed by a chorus of screams from the dining room. The northeast quadrant was sagging further. Elias didn't flinch. He took Julian's expensive alligator leather belt and looped it through the spokes of the frost-covered valve wheel. He created a makeshift lever, bracing his heavy boots against a structural joist. His muscles corded under his flannel shirt, his jaw tightening until the tendons in his neck stood out like steel cables. "Julian, grab the end of the belt. When I say pull, you give it everything you've got. If this belt snaps, we're done." Julian grabbed the leather, his knuckles white. He looked at Elias, seeing the soot and grease on the man's face, and felt a surge of adrenaline he hadn't felt since his days in uniform. "Ready, Captain," he shouted over the roar of the wind. "Pull." Elias roared. The two men strained against the frozen metal. The belt groaned, the high-end leather stretching to its absolute limit. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The building tilted another degree, and the sound of breaking glass from above became a constant, terrifying rain. Then, with a sound like a gunshot, the valve cracked. A jet of black, scalding hydraulic fluid sprayed out, narrowly missing Elias's face, but the wheel began to turn. Elias didn't stop. He threw his entire weight into the rotation, his hands slick with the very fluid that was supposed to be the building's lifeblood. "It's opening." Julian cried out, his voice a mix of terror and triumph. He could feel the vibration in the floor changing. The violent, rhythmic stuttering was smoothing out into a steady, heavy thrum. The secondary bypass was finally engaging. The building's brain was still dead, but its heart was being manually forced to beat again. Elias didn't celebrate. He was already looking at the next set of gauges, his mind calculating the flow rate. He knew that stabilizing the pressure was only half the battle. They still had to lock the mechanical shear pins into place, or the floor would eventually slide right off its mounting. He wiped a streak of hot oil from his forehead, leaving a dark smudge across his brow. We're not out of the woods yet. The dampers are equalizing, but the structural pins in the northeast joist are still underseated. We have to get to the end of the catwalk and manually drive them home with the sledge. He pointed to a dark, narrow passage where the wind was howling through the gap in the building's skin. The space was barely wide enough for a man to crawl through, and it was swaying over a 90-story drop. Julian looked at the gap and felt his stomach turn. "I can't go out there, Elias," Julian whispered, his legs shaking. That's open air. We'll fall." Elias looked at him, then thought of Leo sitting in the center of that room, trusting his father to fix the world. He thought of the waitress who thought he was trash, and the executives who laughed at his boots. He didn't have time for fear. "You don't have to go out there, Julian. I do. You just stay here and keep this valve open. If you let it close, the pressure will build back up and blow the seals. Hold it like your life depends on it, because it does." He grabbed a heavy mallet from a nearby emergency locker and began to crawl toward the abyss, the lion of the Helmand moving toward the edge of the world. Elias felt the cold wind hitting his face as he neared the breach. It was a raw, howling force that smelled of rain and ozone. He didn't look down. He only looked at the massive steel pin that was protruding halfway out of its housing. It was the only thing left to secure. Every strike of the mallet would be a gamble against the wind. He took a deep breath, centered his weight, and prepared to strike the final blow for his son's future. He raised the hammer, eyes fixed. The wind at 90 stories up was a living thing, a cold, invisible monster that clawed at his skin and tried to pry his fingers from the vibrating steel. He crawled through the narrow passage, his boots scraping against the metal grating as he neared the literal edge of the world. Through the jagged gap in the building's outer skin, he could see the distant, flickering lights of the city far below, looking like a handful of spilled diamonds on a black velvet cloth. The rain was horizontal here, needle-sharp and ice-cold, blurring his vision and making the steel beams as slick as ice. He didn't let himself think about the drop. He didn't let himself think about the fact that only a few inches of buckling metal separated him from a 90-story plunge. He only thought about the heavy structural pin, the 6-inch thick steel bolt that was currently protruding 3 inches from its reinforced socket. "Keep that valve open, Julian." He roared, his voice nearly snatched away by the gale. He looked back over his shoulder to see the billionaire, his face purple with effort, leaning back against the alligator leather belt. Julian was no longer the poised, arrogant owner of a luxury empire. He was a man drenched in oil and sweat, fighting for every breath in the dark. He gave a frantic nod, his teeth gritted as he held the manual bypass against the building's internal pressure. He was finally doing something that couldn't be delegated or bought, and the realization seemed to ground him in a way his millions never could. The mechanic turned back to the task at hand. He braced his knees against the primary joist, anchoring his left hand into a junction box for stability. In his right hand, the heavy sledgehammer felt like a natural extension of his arm. This was the work he understood, the brutal, honest physics of force meeting resistance. He took a breath, timing his movement with the rhythmic swaying of the tower. He waited for the building to lean into the wind, for the moment of maximum tension on the frame. Now. He grunted, swinging the hammer in a short, powerful arc. The sound of the sledge striking the steel pin was like a cannon shot, a sharp, metallic clack that echoed through the guts of the skyscraper. He felt the vibration travel up his arm, into his shoulder, and down his spine. The pin didn't budge. He struck again, and again, the rhythmic clang, clang, clang of his labor sounding like a war drum in the heart of the storm. With every strike, he poured years of frustration into the metal. The frustration of being ignored, the frustration of being called trash, and the deep, abiding need to keep his son safe in a world that didn't value his father's hands. On the fourth strike, the pin finally jumped forward an inch. The building let out a sharp, cracking sound, and for a terrifying second, the floor beneath him dropped another few millimeters. He didn't hesitate. He swung with everything he had left, his flannel shirt tearing at the shoulder as his muscles bunched and released. He was the lion of the Helmand again, a man of steel and grit who refused to let the earth, or the sky, take what was his. With a final, agonizing blow, the pin seated itself into the locking housing, with a solid, deep thud that vibrated through the entire floor. The effect was instantaneous. The violent, erratic groaning of the frame subsided into a low, steady hum. The floor beneath them stopped its sickening tilt, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to level out as the secondary hydraulic system finally caught the load. The wind was still howling, and the rain was still cold, but the building was no longer a dying animal. It was a machine again, and its master was a man in a stained canvas jacket. He leaned his forehead against the cold steel for a moment, his lungs burning and his hands shaking from the effort. He had done it. He began to crawl back toward the valve station, his movements slower now that the adrenaline was beginning to ebb. Julian was still there, his hands raw from the leather belt, his eyes wide and searching as the mechanic emerged from the darkness. When Julian saw the look on his face, he let out a jagged, hysterical laugh that turned into a sob. He slowly released the tension on the belt, and the valve stayed open, the pressure gauges finally settling into the green safety zone. "It's holding," Julian whispered, his voice cracking. He looked at the man who had just risked everything for a room full of people who hadn't even given him a chair. "Elias, you did it. You did." Julian let go of the leather belt, his arms falling to his sides like dead weights as the tension finally bled out of the room. The mechanical screams had been replaced by a low, rhythmic hum, the sound of a building that had regained its balance. He looked at his hands, which were blistered and stained a deep industrial black, then up at the man who had orchestrated the miracle. Elias was already moving, wiping the worst of the hydraulic fluid from his forearms with a discarded rag. He didn't look like a man who had just saved 100 lives. He looked like a man who had finished a particularly difficult day at the garage and was ready to go home. He gestured toward the ladder, his expression unreadable beneath the soot and sweat. The climb back up was slower, the exhaustion finally catching up to both of them. When Elias pushed the service hatch open and stepped back into the dining room of the Zenith, the transition was jarring. The emergency lights were still casting a crimson glow over the ruins of luxury, but the frantic swaying had stopped. The air was still, and the silence was absolute. Dozens of pairs of eyes turned toward the hatch, watching as the man they had mocked emerged from the floor like a specter from the underworld. He was silhouetted by the dying light of a bruised sunset that filtered through the cracked windows, his torn flannel shirt and grease-streaked face providing a stark contrast to the polished marble surroundings. Julian followed him out, looking like a different person. His silk shirt was ruined, his expensive hair was matted with oil, and he was missing a shoe, but he stood taller than he had all night. He walked to the center of the room, his gaze sweeping over the patrons who were slowly standing up from their crouched positions. He saw the executives who had laughed, the socialites who had whispered, and Sasha, who was still huddled near the center table where Leo sat. The owner didn't say a word to them at first. He simply looked at Elias, then at the room, allowing the weight of the moment to settle into their bones. "You all should take a very good look at this man." Julian's voice rang out, no longer shaky, but filled with a raw, vibrating authority that demanded attention. He pointed at Elias, who was standing quietly by the bar, checking the pulse of his son with a gentle hand. "2 hours ago, most of you were snickering while my staff tried to throw him out because he didn't have the right jacket. You thought he was a stain on your evening. You thought his presence was an insult to your status. Well, I want you to know something. While you were worried about your wine and your rugs, the building's primary structural support was shearing off its mounting. We were seconds away from a 90-story freefall." A collective gasp rippled through the room. The woman with the silk pashmina clutched her throat, her eyes fixed on the cracked pillar that Elias had warned them about. The reality of how close they had come to death began to sink in, stripping away the last remnants of their elitist facades. They weren't powerful hedge fund managers or socialites anymore. They were survivors, and they were looking at their savior. "This man," Julian continued, his voice cracking with emotion, "is Captain Elias Thorne. He's a former lead combat engineer for the 101st, a man who has built bridges under fire and saved more lives than everyone in this room combined. He didn't have to stay. He could have taken his son and left the moment he saw the danger, and nobody would have blamed him for leaving people who treated him like garbage, but he didn't. He went into the guts of this building and manually held the world together with nothing but his bare hands and a leather belt. He is the only reason any of you are breathing right now." The silence that followed was heavy with a profound, stinging shame. The executive who had raised a mock toast earlier lowered his head, his face burning. Sasha looked as if she wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. She looked at the mechanic, this trash she had tried to erase, and saw a hero whose dignity was so vast it didn't even require her recognition. She realized that in her quest to protect the restaurant's image, she had almost destroyed the very people she was trying to serve by dismissing the only expert in the room. Elias didn't acknowledge the praise. He wasn't interested in their guilt or their sudden, fawning admiration. He reached out and ruffled Leo's hair, his hand still dark with the oil of the machine he'd conquered. "You okay, Leo?" he asked softly, his voice a warm, steady anchor in the room. The boy looked up, his eyes shining with a pride that eclipsed the glowing city lights behind them. "I told them, Dad," Leo whispered, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "I told them you could fix anything." Elias smiled, a small, tired, but genuine expression that reached his eyes. He picked up his son, the boy's small suit crinkling against his father's rough work jacket. As he turned toward the exit, the patrons didn't mock him. They didn't whisper. Instead, they parted like the Red Sea, creating a wide, respectful path for the man and his son. There was no applause, just a deep, humble silence that served as the greatest tribute he could have received. He walked through the foyer of his greatest victory, a king in mechanic's rags, heading toward the elevator to finally take his son home. "Elias, wait." Julian's voice echoed through the now steady foyer, stopping the mechanic just as the elevator doors whispered open. Elias paused, the weight of his son against his shoulder a comforting reminder of why he had endured the night's chaos. He turned back, his expression guarded but calm. Julian wasn't looking at him yet. Instead, the billionaire's gaze was fixed on Sasha. The head waitress stood near her mahogany podium, which was now covered in a fine layer of white plaster dust and debris. She looked small, her shoulders hunched as she tried to make herself invisible against the backdrop of the luxury she had so viciously guarded. The silence in the room was surgical, everyone waiting to see how the final pieces of the night's drama would fall into place. Julian walked toward her, his footsteps heavy and deliberate on the marble floor. "Sasha," he said, his voice deceptively quiet. "Earlier this evening, you told this man that he didn't contribute to society. You told him that his presence was a smudge on the standards of this establishment. You were so blinded by the scuffs on his boots that you didn't even notice the building was screaming for help." He stopped inches from her, his oil-stained face a stark contrast to her trembling, perfectly manicured appearance. "You were right about one thing, though. There is someone in this room who doesn't belong. There is someone whose presence is an insult to everything I want the Zenith to stand for. Julian, please." "I was just trying to maintain the image," Sasha whispered, her voice cracking as a single tear tracked through the heavy foundation on her cheek. "The reservation list, the dress code. I didn't want the VIPs to feel uncomfortable. I thought I was doing my job." She looked around at the patrons, hoping for a shred of support, but the executives who had cheered her earlier were now looking at their own shoes, unwilling to catch her eye. The very crowd she had tried to impress had turned on her the moment her judgment proved to be a liability to their survival. "The image?" Julian let out a short, bitter laugh that sounded like snapping glass. "You thought the image was more important than the integrity of the structure. You thought a silk tie mattered more than a man's character. My guests weren't in danger because of Elias's jacket. They were in danger because my staff was too arrogant to listen to the only expert in the room. You didn't protect the standards, Sasha. You corrupted them. You turned my restaurant into a cage for snobs instead of a pinnacle of excellence. Pack your things. You're fired, effective immediately. And don't bother asking for a reference. I'll be sure to tell every owner in this city exactly how your standards nearly cost 100 people their lives tonight." Sasha didn't argue. She didn't even look up. She simply turned and walked toward the staff entrance, her head bowed as the same people who had laughed at Elias now watched her departure with cold, silent judgment. The poetic justice was absolute. The woman who had tried to cast a man out for his appearance was now being exiled because of her own internal ugliness. As the service door swung shut behind her, Julian turned back to Elias. The billionaire took a deep breath, his hands shaking slightly as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a leather-bound checkbook that had somehow survived the crawlspace. "Elias, I know money can't fix how you and your son were treated tonight," Julian said, his voice thick with a genuine, humble remorse. "But I want to make this right. I'm offering you a blank check, whatever you want for the garage, for Leo's education, for your future. And more than that, I want you as my chief structural consultant for the entire Vane Group. We have 20 towers in this city, and I don't want to spend another night wondering if they're holding up. I need the Lion of the Helmand. I need a man who knows what's happening beneath the surface." He held the pen out, his eyes pleading for a chance at redemption. The patrons leaned in, expecting the mechanic to jump at the life-changing offer. To them, this was the ultimate victory, the moment the underdog was elevated to their level. But Elias just looked at the checkbook, then at Julian's face, and finally at his son. He didn't see a lottery win, he saw another set of chains. He had spent his life fixing the world's mistakes, and right now, all he wanted was to be a father. "I don't need your money, Julian," Elias said softly, his voice carrying a weight that silenced the room. "And I don't want a title in a skyscraper. I like my garage. I like the way the air smells of old engines and honest work. But I'll take the consultant job, on one condition. You don't pay me in blank checks. You pay me by making sure that the next time a man walks in here with dirt on his hands, You give him a chair and the best view in the house. You change the heart of this place, and maybe I'll help you keep the roof up." He didn't wait for a handshake. He stepped into the elevator, the doors closing on the stunned billionaire, and a room full of people who would never look at a worker the same way again. The elevator descent was a silent, vertical glide through the heart of the city's glowing ribcage. Inside the transparent glass capsule, the air was cool and pressurized, a stark contrast to the humid, oil-drenched nightmare of the crawlspace. Elias Thorne stood with his back against the glass, his hand resting firmly on Leo's shoulder. The boy was staring out at the receding skyline, his reflection in the glass showing a small, determined face that seemed to have aged years in a single evening. The red clip-on tie was slightly crooked, and his charcoal suit was dusted with the same white plaster that covered his father's boots, but to Elias, the boy had never looked more like a man. "Dad?" Leo whispered, his voice small against the soft hum of the elevator's motor. "Are we still going to get dessert?" Elias looked down, a lump forming in his throat that had nothing to do with smoke or structural fatigue. He realized that through the terror of the tilting floors and the roar of the wind, his son hadn't lost faith in the simple promise of a birthday celebration. He squeezed Leo's shoulder, a weary but proud smile touching his lips. "You bet we are, buddy. But I think we've had enough of the sky for one night. How about we find a place where the floor doesn't move, and the people know how to smile back?" The doors whispered open in the ground-floor lobby, a vast echoing cavern of polished granite and silent security guards. The night manager, a man who hadn't yet heard of the chaos 90 floors above, looked up from his desk, his brow furrowing at the sight of the grease-stained mechanic and the disheveled child. He started to open his mouth, perhaps to ask how they had bypassed the service entrance, but he caught the look in Elias's eyes. It was the gaze of a man who had stared down a collapsing world and won. The manager swallowed his words and stepped back, intuitively sensing that his authority meant nothing in the presence of such raw, quiet power. They walked out of the revolving doors and into the crisp night air. The rain had turned into a gentle mist, and the streetlights reflected off the damp pavement in long, shimmering ribbons. Elias led Leo to his old Ford truck, parked 3 blocks away in a dimly lit lot. The vehicle was a beast of rusted iron and peeling paint, a dinosaur among the sleek Teslas and Maseratis that lined the curb. As Elias climbed into the driver's seat, the familiar scent of old upholstery and WD-40 enveloped him like a warm blanket. He felt the tension finally begin to leave his spine as he turned the key. The engine turning over with a reliable, throaty growl that sounded more like music than any symphony played at the Zenith. As they drove through the city, passing the glowing monuments of wealth and the dark alleys of the working class, Elias felt a profound sense of peace. He had spent years trying to hide from the man he used to be, thinking that the Lion of the Helmand belonged in a past he'd left behind on a dusty riverbank. But tonight, he realized that the skills he'd honed in the dirt were exactly what made him the father he needed to be. He didn't need a skyscraper to be tall, he just needed to be the man who held things together when they started to break. 1 month later, Elias was back under the hood of a sedan in his quiet garage when a sleek black limousine pulled up to the curb. Julian Vane stepped out, looking different. He wasn't wearing a designer suit, he was in a simple button-down and jeans. He didn't approach Elias with a checkbook this time. Instead, he handed him a framed photograph. It was a picture of the new entrance to the Zenith. Beside the mahogany podium where Sasha once stood, there was now a bronze plaque. It depicted a pair of work boots and a compass, with a simple inscription, "True strength is found in the hands that build, not the pockets that pay." "We had our first mechanic's night yesterday," Julian said, leaning against the garage doorframe. A group of night shift welders came in for dinner. They were seated at the best table in the house. My new manager didn't even look at their boots, he just asked them how they liked their steak. Julian smiled, a genuine, humble expression. The building is stable, Elias, but the heart is finally starting to beat right. Elias wiped his hands on a rag and nodded, a silent understanding passing between the two veterans. He had given Julian more than a fixed building, he'd given him a conscience. And in return, the city would never look quite the same to the man with the dirty fingernails. True value isn't a status you achieve, it's the character you reveal when everything else falls away. It's about the bridges we build between each other, long after the steel and glass have faded. This wasn't just a story about a single dad in a restaurant, it was a reminder that the world stays upright because of the people we often refuse to see. Ask me for next story title. Subscribe and don't miss our next story, I'm the CEO's daughter, she smirked. Then the janitor dropped his bucket, and the boardroom went silent. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments what injustice should we tackle next.